A strange puppy was about to be put down until the vet read its collar. But what she found wasn't just a name. It was a forgotten past, a burned-down house, a missing child, and a mystery no one was supposed to uncover. If that child was never found, why does this puppy seem to remember? What if this isn't just a stray, but the key to unlocking a lost life? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The wind howled outside Riverside Animal Clinic as Dr. Lillian Carter filed her last patient report of the day. Rain pelted against the windows, creating a steady drumbeat that matched her tired movements. Her shoulders ached from a 12-hour shift that had included 2 emergency surgeries and a seemingly endless stream of routine checkups. Just 5 more minutes, she mumbled to herself, organizing the last of her paperwork. The clock on the wall showed 8:55 p.m., and she could already taste the chamomile tea waiting for her at home. The front door burst open with a gust of wet air, making Lillian jump. Kevin Mitchell, the local animal control officer, stumbled in, his uniform soaked. In his arms, wrapped in a soggy towel, was a small bundle that trembled violently. Dr. Carter, Kevin said, water dripping from his cap. "I'm sorry to come so late, but I didn't know where else to go." Lillian's exhaustion momentarily lifted as her medical instincts kicked in. "What have you got there?" Kevin carefully unwrapped the towel, revealing a golden brown puppy no more than 4 months old. Its fur was matted with rain and mud, and its eyes were huge with fear. "Found this little guy behind the grocery store. The shelter's packed full. We got twice as many animals as we should tomorrow morning," he trailed off. But Lillian knew what he meant. The shelter's euthanasia schedule was an unfortunate reality she'd learned to live with, even if she never got used to it. "Kevin," Lillian began, her heart already aching. "You know I can't take in another stray. The clinic is at capacity, and The puppy let out a small whimper that seemed to pierce straight through her carefully constructed walls. "Just for tonight?" Kevin pleaded. "Maybe we can find something tomorrow." Lillian sighed and gestured to the exam table. As Kevin set the puppy down, she grabbed a fresh towel and began drying the trembling creature. Despite her determination to remain professional, her touch was gentle, motherly, almost. The puppy responded by pressing against her hands, seeking warmth. During her examination, Lillian's fingers found a collar beneath the matted fur. It was worn leather, cracked and faded. She squinted at the nearly illegible text, but the letters were too worn to make out. "Well, you're healthy at least," she told the puppy, trying to ignore how its tail wagged at the sound of her voice. No signs of injury or illness. Kevin watched hopefully, but Lillian shook her head. "I'll keep him overnight in the clinic, but that's all I can do." She knew if she let herself get attached, the pain would be unbearable. She'd learned that lesson the hard way. Leading the puppy to the holding kennels, Lillian placed it inside with a soft blanket and some water. As she closed the door, the puppy pressed its nose against the bars, its soulful brown eyes following her every move. Its small whimper echoed in the quiet clinic, making Lillian's chest tighten with an emotion she refused to name. The next morning arrived with patches of sunlight breaking through the storm clouds. Lillian sat in her car outside the clinic, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had long since gone cold. She'd barely slept, her mind drifting back to those pleading brown eyes. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the clinic doors, 15 minutes earlier than usual. The familiar antiseptic smell greeted her, along with the occasional barker or meow from the overnight patients. She hung up her coat and organized her files, doing everything possible to delay the inevitable visit to the holding kennels. Finally, she couldn't put it off any longer. Walking down the corridor, her footsteps echoed against the tile floor. The puppy was already awake, its tail thumping against the kennel floor the moment it saw her. "Good morning, little one," Lillian said softly, surprised by the warmth in her own voice. The puppy responded with a happy whine that made her heart flutter. She opened the kennel door, and the puppy immediately pressed against her legs, seeking attention. Its fur had dried overnight, revealing a beautiful golden brown coat that shimmered in the morning light. Lillian's fingers found themselves scratching behind its ears before she could stop herself. "Let's take a better look at that collar, shall we?" She carefully lifted the puppy onto the examination table. In the bright morning light, she could see the leather collar was expensive, despite its worn condition. Her fingers worked carefully to unbuckle it, and as she turned it over in her hands, something caught her eye. There, on the inside of the collar, were faint engravings. Lillian squinted, tilting the collar toward the light. Her heart began to race as the words became clear. If found, bring me home. Below the message was an address, 1247 Maple Grove Road. Lillian's hands began to shake. She knew that address. Everyone in town knew that address. 3 years ago, the Victorian house that once stood there had burned to ground in a tragic fire. Now it was just an empty lot, surrounded by a chain-link fence and overgrown with weeds. The puppy nudged her hand with its wet nose, bringing her back to the present. Lillian stared at the collar, then at the puppy, her mind racing with questions. Should she dig deeper into this mystery? The logical part of her brain told her to leave it alone, to call Kevin and have him take the puppy to another shelter in the next town. But as she looked into those trusting brown eyes, something stirred inside her. Years of keeping people and animals at arm's length had made her an expert at ignoring her instincts. But this felt different. This felt important. The puppy sat quietly, watching her with an almost knowing expression. Lillian ran her fingers over the engraved address again, a strange certainty settling over her. There was more to this story, more to this puppy, than a simple case of abandonment. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Maple Grove Road as Lillian's car crawled to stop in front of 1247. The burned-out lot stood like an open wound in the otherwise well-kept neighborhood. Chain-link fencing surrounded the property, but years of neglect had allowed wild grass and thorny bushes to claim the space where a house once stood. Lillian sat in her car, the collar clutched in her hand, its engraving catching the sunlight. The puppy dozed in the carrier on the passenger seat, occasionally making small sleeping sounds. "What happened here?" she whispered to herself, stepping out of the car. As she approached the fence, movement caught her eye. An elderly woman emerged from the house next door, a watering can in her weathered hands. "Can I help you?" the woman called out, her voice kind but cautious. Lillian walked over, introducing herself. "I'm Dr. Carter from the animal clinic. I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm trying to learn about the family that lived here." The woman's face softened with recognition. "I'm Martha Collins. I've lived here for 40 years. She set down her watering can. "Such a tragedy. What happened to the Hayes family? Could you tell me about them?" Lillian asked gently. "Martha, can you tell me about the Hayes family?" Martha's eyes grew distant. "Daniel and Sarah Hayes. They moved here with their children in 2019. The fire happened just a year later." She dabbed at her eyes with her apron. "The police said it started in the kitchen, late at night. They found most of the family." Lillian noticed Martha's choice of words. "Most?" Martha nodded slowly. "Their youngest, Tommy. He was just 6. They never found him. The police searched for weeks." She trailed off, looking at the overgrown lot. "Some say he must have wandered off before the fire. Others think." She couldn't finish the sentence. Lillian's hand tightened around the collar. "When exactly did this happen?" 3 years ago next month," Martha replied. "July 15th, 2020. I'll never forget that date." Lillian thanked Martha and walked back to her car, her mind racing. Something about this didn't add up. The collar looked old, yes, but not 3 years old. And why would it appear now on a puppy that seemed barely a few months old? Back in her car, she pulled out her phone and began searching news articles about the fire. The puppy stirred in its carrier, watching her with those knowing eyes. As Lillian scrolled through the articles, a chill ran down her spine. There were so many unanswered questions about that night. The cause of the fire remained uncertain. The missing child was never found. No bodies were ever. Movement in her rear-view mirror caught her attention. A figure stood in the shadows of a large oak tree across the street, partially hidden behind the trunk. When Lillian turned to look directly, the figure was gone, leaving her to wonder if her mind was playing tricks on her. Back at her small ranch house, Lillian spread old newspaper clippings across her kitchen table. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, but she barely noticed. The dim light from her reading lamp cast a warm glow over the yellowing papers, each one telling a piece of the tragic story. The Hayes family fire claims for, one headline declared. But as Lillian read deeper, the details didn't match. Only 3 bodies were found: Sarah Hayes, her husband Daniel, and their older son Michael. Tommy, the youngest, had vanished without a trace. Lillian picked up her phone, hesitating for just a moment before dialing. After 3 rings, a familiar voice answered. "Porter here." "Ryan, it's Lillian Carter." "Doc, long time no hear. What's got you calling at this hour?" Lillian glanced at the clock. 10:45 p.m. "I need some information about an old case. The Hayes house fire from 3 years ago." There was a pause on the other end. "That's ancient history, Lil. Why are you digging into that?" She told him about the puppy and the collar. Try and keep the urgency out of her voice. "Something's not adding up, Ryan. I can feel it." Ryan's voice softened. "That case tore this town apart. We searched for months. The kid was never found. But what if—" Lillian began. "I'll send you what I can," he interrupted. "But Lil, be careful. Some cases are better left alone." The next morning at the clinic, Lillian's assistant Sophie watched her with worried eyes as she pored over the files Ryan had sent. "Dr. Carter?" Sophie's gentle voice broke through her concentration. "That puppy needs his morning checkup." Lillian nodded absently, still reading. "Doc." Sophie placed a hand on her shoulder. "I know that look. You're getting wrapped up in something big, aren't you?" Lillian finally looked up at her young assistant. Sophie's face was etched with concern. I need to know the truth, Sophie. The truth." Sophie sighed, sitting down beside her. "Or are you looking for another broken thing to fix, like after James?" The name hit Lillian like a physical blow. She hadn't heard anyone mention her late husband in years. "This is different," Lillian insisted, but her voice wavered. "Is it?" Sophie's eyes were kind but firm. "You can't save everyone, document. Sometimes you have to let the past stay in the past." Lillian stood up and walked to the recovery area, where the puppy lay sleeping. Its chest rose and fell peacefully, paws twitching slightly as it dreamed. Those mysterious eyes that seemed to hold so many secrets were now closed in peaceful slumber. Looking at the sleeping pup, Lillian felt her resolve strengthen. Sophie was wrong. This wasn't about saving anyone. This was about uncovering the truth. And something told her this puppy was the key to it all. The morning sun had barely risen when Lillian's phone buzzed on her desk. She'd been at the clinic since dawn, unable to sleep after spending most of the night reviewing the Hayes case files. "Lillian, you need to hear this." Ryan's voice crackled through the speaker. His usual calm demeanor was replaced with an urgency that made her sit up straight. "What is it?" "I've been going through old witness statements. 3 different people reported seeing a child matching Tommy Hayes's description weeks after fire. We dismissed them at the time. Thought they were just desperate to help." Ryan paused, papers rustling in the background. One witness swore she saw a boy with a puppy living in the woods behind the old Miller property. Lillian's heart began to race. "Ryan, are you saying?" "I'm saying the kid might have survived somehow. And if he did, he could still be out there." Lillian finished, her voice barely above a whisper. She hung up and hurried to the recovery area where the puppy lay in its kennel. The mysterious collar felt heavier than ever in her pocket. Sophie was already there, preparing medications for the day's patients. "Sophie, can you pull up the Hayes family photo from the news archives?" Sophie frowned but did as asked, turning her computer screen toward Lillian. The image showed a happy family of 4: mother, father, and 2 boys. The younger one, Tommy, couldn't have been more than 7. Lillian lifted the puppy from its kennel and held it facing the screen. The reaction was immediate and startling. The dog's ears perked up, its tail began wagging frantically, and it let out a series of excited whimpers, pawing at the air toward the image. "Oh my God!" Sophie whispered, her skepticism visibly shaken. Before Lillian could respond, her phone rang again. The shelter's number flashed on the screen. Her stomach dropped as she answered. "Dr. Carter, this is Dave from County Animal Control. About that stray brought in yesterday." We need him transferred back here by noon. The euthanasia schedule. No. Lillian cut him off, her voice firm. I need more time. Doc, we're overcrowded as it is. Rules are rules. The puppy pressed against her leg, those knowing eyes looking up at her. In that moment, Lillian knew this wasn't just about saving a dog. It was about solving a mystery that had haunted their town for years. A child's life might depend on what she did next. Sophie, she turned to her assistant, determination written across her face. Cancel my appointments for the day. All of them. But, Dr. Carter, Dash, this can't wait anymore. That little boy might still be out there, and this puppy might be our only link to finding him. Lillian's car screeched into the shelter's parking lot, sending gravel flying. Her hands shook as she rushed to the front doors, the morning sun casting long shadows through the windows. The puppy from yesterday, she gasped at a young man at the front desk. I need to see him right away. Marcus Bennett, his name tag gleaming under the fluorescent lights, looked up from his computer with concerned eyes. The tan mixed breed? I'm sorry, Dr. Carter, but they already took him. The blood drained from Lillian's face. Took him where? To the county facility. Marcus checked his watch. About 20 minutes ago. No, no, no. Lillian whispered, already backing toward the door. Which facility? The one on Oak Street. Dr. Carter Dash. She was already running back to her car. The drive across town felt like an eternity. Every red light and obstacle seemed to slow her down, each second stretching longer between her, and not just saving a puppy, but possibly unlocking the key to a decade-old mystery. Her tires squealed as she took corners too fast, her heart pounding in her chest. The county facility loomed ahead, a stark, concrete building surrounded by chain-link fences. Lillian parked haphazardly, leaving her car door wide open, as she sprinted toward the entrance. Just as she reached for the door handle, movement caught her eye. A man was walking quickly around the side of the building, carrying something wrapped in a blanket. The puppy's familiar tan tail hung limply over his arm. Wait! Lillian shouted, changing direction to follow him. Please stop. The man froze, slowly turned to face her. He was tall, thin, with dark hair that fell across his forehead. But it was his eyes that made Lillian's breath catch in her throat. Eyes she'd seen before in that old newspaper photograph. They stared at each other in the cold morning air, the puppy wiggling in the man's arms. There was something in his face, a shadow of that little boy from Hayes' family photo. The same determined set of his jaw, the same slight tilt of his head. That dog, Lillian said softly, taking a careful step forward. He's yours, isn't he? The man tightened his grip on the bundle. You need to leave this alone. His voice was rough and used, but there was a tremor in it that spoke of deep pain. I can't do that, Lillian said, taking another step. That collar. You wanted someone to find it, didn't you? To understand. The man's eyes widened slightly, a flash of recognition crossing his face. For a moment, he looked like that 7-year-old boy again, lost and afraid. Who are you? Lillian asked, though she already knew the answer. The truth was written in every line of his face, in the way the puppy nuzzled against him with complete trust. The man swallowed hard, looking down at the dog in his arms. When he raised his eyes to meet hers again, they were filled with years of unspoken stories. The tension crackled between them like static electricity. Daniel Hayes, the man finally whispered, his voice trembling. He held the puppy closer, his shoulders tense as Lillian took another careful step forward. Why are you so interested in this dog? Daniel asked, his voice carrying a mix of suspicion and confusion. It's just a stray I found wandering around my neighborhood last week. The puppy, which had been trembling slightly in Daniel's arms, suddenly perked up. Its tail began to wag, thumping steadily against the blanket. Despite its earlier fear at the facility, it seemed completely at ease with Daniel. Lillian watched this interaction carefully, noting how naturally Daniel cradled the small animal. That collar was wearing, she said softly. It had an address engraved on it. An old address. Daniel's brow furrowed. What address? 1247 Maple Grove Road, Lillian said, her voice steady but watchful. Something flickered across Daniel's face. Confusion, perhaps a ghost of recognition that he quickly dismissed. Never heard of it. But Lillian couldn't shake the feeling she'd seen his face before. Those eyes, that particular way he tilted his head when listening, it all seemed to match the grainy newspaper photo she'd studied the night before. The house that used to be there, she continued, carefully watching his reaction. It burned down 15 years ago. There was a family. Look, Daniel cut in, shifting uncomfortably. I don't know anything about any fire. I just found this dog, and when I couldn't keep it, I brought it here. That's all. The puppy whimpered softly, pressing closer to Daniel's chest, without seeming to think about it. He gently scratched behind its ears, exactly where Lillian had noticed a favorite spot during her examination. Sometimes, Lillian said, choosing her words carefully, when bad things happen to us as children, our minds protect us by... The only thing that matters is being safe. Daniel interrupted suddenly, his voice distant as if reciting something from memory. That's what I always say. Just get somewhere safe. Lillian's breath caught in her throat. Those words, she'd read them just hours ago in the old newspaper article. They were the exact words a missing Hayes child had reportedly said to the neighbor who'd found him hiding in their garden shed the night before the fire. Words that had never been published anywhere else. She stared at Daniel Hayes with new understanding. Here was a man who had no idea who he really was. No memory of the tragedy that had shaped his life. The lost little boy had been here all along, carrying his past like a lockbox he couldn't open. The puppy licked Daniel's hand, and he smiled automatically, the same gentle smile she'd seen in that old family photo. Lillian followed Daniel out into the parking lot, the evening air heavy with unsaid words. The puppy was still cradled in his arms, looking completely at home there. "Wait, please," she called after him. "Can we talk for just a minute?" Daniel slowed his steps but didn't turn around. "There's nothing to talk about. What do you remember about your childhood?" Lillian asked gently, catching up to him. The gravel crunched under her feet as she moved to face him. "Not much to remember," he said flatly. "Grew up in the system. Different foster homes, different schools. That's all there is to it." His jaw tightened. "And I don't like looking back." Lillian pulled the worn collar from her pocket, holding it where he could see the faded inscription. "This means something, Daniel. The way this puppy responds to you. It's not normal for a stray. Animals can sense things we can't." Daniel's eyes flickered to the collar, then away. His hands tightened slightly on the puppy, which responded by nuzzling closer. "You're reading too much into this," Daniel said. "It's just a friendly dog." "Please," Lillian said, reaching into her bag. "Just look at one thing. That's all I'm asking." She pulled out the newspaper clipping she had carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve. The photograph was old, but clear enough. A family of 4 at a summer picnic. 2 children played in the background. One of them, a boy about 7 years old. Daniel's face went pale as she held it out. His hands began to shake so badly that the puppy whimpered in concern. I don't," he stammered, staring at the image. The boy in the photo had the same distinctive dimple in his right cheek, the same way of tilting his head slightly to the left. "That can't be." "It's you," Lillian said softly. "Isn't it?" Daniel's breathing became shallow. "I don't remember," he whispered, but his voice cracked on the words. "I don't remember any of this, but..." He swallowed hard, still staring at the photo. "That's me, isn't it?" The puppy licked his chin, as if trying to comfort him. Daniel barely seemed to notice. Without warning, he thrust the puppy into Lillian's arms. "I can't do this," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I can't. I don't want to know." Before Lillian could say another word, he turned and walked quickly toward his car, his shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. The puppy whined in Lillian's arms, watching him go. "Daniel," she called after him, but he didn't look back. He got into his car and drove away, leaving Lillian standing in the parking lot with the puppy in her arms and a photograph of a past he wasn't ready to face. That night, Daniel tossed and turned in his bed, sweat beading on his forehead as fragments of dreams invaded his sleep. The images came in flashes, like broken pieces of movie he couldn't quite remember watching. Fire, orange and angry, licking up walls he somehow knew but couldn't place. Heat that felt too real, too familiar. A woman's voice cut through the flames. Daniel, Danny, where are you? The voice was filled with panic and love. A mother's voice. His mother's voice. Then came the barking, high-pitched and desperate. A puppy, so much like the one from today, crying out in terror. In his dream, Daniel reached for it, but the smoke was too thick. He jolted awake with a gasp, his t-shirt soaked through with sweat. The digital clock on his nightstand showed 3:17 a.m. His heart hammered against his ribs as he sat up, running shaking hands through his damp hair. Just a dream, he muttered to himself. But the words fell hollow. The terror had been too real, the details too specific. Across town, Lillian sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by papers and her laptop's pale glow. She couldn't sleep, not with the mystery of Daniel Hayes weighing on her mind. The puppy dozed in a makeshift bed nearby, occasionally whimpering in its sleep. She had spent hours on the phone, calling foster agencies and group homes, piecing together Daniel's past, or trying to. Something wasn't adding up. This can't be right, she mumbled, scrolling through the records a sympathetic social worker had emailed her. Daniel's first documented placement was at age 7, but there was nothing before that. No birth certificate, no previous history, just a blank space where his early childhood should have been. The date of his first placement caught her eye. It was exactly 2 weeks after the fire. Lillian sat back, her coffee growing cold beside her. The pieces were starting to fit together in a way that made her stomach clench. She'd seen similar cases in her psychology courses during vet school. Children who experience severe trauma sometimes block out entire portions of their lives. He doesn't remember because he can't, she whispered to herself. He's buried it all. The puppy stirred in its sleep, letting out a soft whine. Lillian glanced at it, remembering how naturally it had settled into Daniel's arms, how his hands had trembled when he saw the photograph. She pulled up another article about trauma-induced memory loss, her mind racing. Daniel Hayes hadn't just lost his family that night. He'd lost himself. His mind had created a wall between then and now, protecting him from memories too painful to bear. But walls could crumble, and when they did, the flood of memories could be overwhelming. Lillian stared at the photograph of young Daniel, his smile bright and untroubled, and wondered what would happen when those memories finally broke through. The morning sun cast long shadows across the construction site as Lillian pulled up in her truck, the puppy sitting anxiously in the passenger seat. She had tracked down Daniel's workplace through some careful questioning at the shelter, learning he worked as a carpenter for a local construction company. Her heart pounded as she spotted him among the workers, measuring boards for what looked like a new house frame. The irony wasn't lost on her. A man who had lost his home to fire, now building homes for others. Daniel, she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. He looked up, surprise flickering across his face. The moment she opened the truck door, the puppy burst out, making a beeline straight for Daniel. The small dog's tail wagged frantically as it circled his boots, letting out excited yips and whimpers. Daniel froze, his measuring tape forgotten in his hand. Something shifted in his expression, a softening around his eyes, a slight tremor in his shoulders. Without seeming to realize what he was doing, he knelt down and reached for the puppy. "Hey there, little guy," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't seem to understand. The puppy pressed against his hand, licking his fingers frantically. Lillian watched, her breath caught in her throat, as Daniel began to unconsciously hum. The melody was soft, almost inaudible, but it was there, a gentle lullaby that seemed to flow from somewhere deep in his buried memories. "That's a beautiful song," Lillian said carefully, watching his reaction. Daniel blinked, as if coming out of a trance. "What song? The one you were just humming?" His brow furrowed. I wasn't." He trailed off, looking confused. The puppy pressed closer, resting its head against his knee. "Daniel," Lillian said gently, "I think this puppy might be able to help you remember things. Things from before." He stiffened. "I told you, there's nothing to remember." "Then what's the harm in spending some time with him?" She held his gaze. Just one night. See how it feels. Daniel looked down at the puppy, which stared back with those same pleading eyes that had caught Lillian's heart that stormy night. His hands trembled slightly as he stroked its soft fur. After what felt like an eternity, he nodded. One night, he said quietly, just to prove there's nothing there. Lillian helped him gather some basic supplies from her truck. Food, a blanket, some toys. As she watched Daniel lead the puppy to his own vehicle, she noticed how naturally they moved together, like two pieces of a puzzle finding their fit. After years apart, Daniel sat on his worn leather couch, trying to focus on the evening news. The puppy hadn't left his side since they'd arrived home, curling up against his leg with unwavering devotion. Every few minutes, his hand would automatically reach down to stroke the soft fur, an action that felt strangely familiar. "You're predetermined, aren't you?" he murmured, scratching behind the puppy's ears. The dog looked up at him with those knowing eyes, and something tugged at the edges of his mind. The news anchor's voice faded into background noise as Daniel felt his eyelids growing heavy. The puppy's warmth against his leg was comforting, almost like a forgotten lullaby. As his eyes closed, the world around him began to shift. Suddenly, he was smaller, much smaller. Sunlight streamed through kitchen windows, casting warm patterns on a wooden floor he somehow knew. The air smelled of maple syrup and coffee, and somewhere nearby, a woman was humming. "Danny, breakfast." The voice was crystal clear, though he hadn't heard it in years. His mother stood at the stove, her dark hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, flipping pancakes with practiced ease. She turned to him with a smile that made his heart ache. "Don't forget to feed Lucky first." Lucky. The name hit him like a physical blow. A small puppy, not unlike the one currently pressed against his leg, bounded across the kitchen floor, tail wagging wildly. Daniel watched through the eyes of his younger self as he poured kibble into a red bowl, giggling as the puppy licked his face in gratitude. The memories shifted, warming him like sunshine. His father reading the newspaper at the kitchen table, ruffling his hair as he passed. His mother's laugh as Lucky chased his sister through the living room. The feeling of absolute safety, a belonging of home. Then the warmth turned to heat, unbearable heat. The roar came first, a sound he would never forget. Flames licked up the walls, consuming everything in their path. Smoke filled his lungs as he heard his mother's desperate screams. "Danny! Danny!" Strong hands grabbed him, pulling him away from the inferno. He reached back, crying out for his family, for Lucky, but the hands were relentless. The cold night air hit his face as he was dragged outside, away from everything he'd ever known. Daniel jerked awake with a gasp, his heart pounding against his ribs. The puppy whined softly, pressing closer as tears streamed down his face. Everything rushed back. The family he'd lost, the life that had been stolen, the memories he'd buried so deep they nearly disappeared forever. With trembling hands, he reached for his phone and dialed Lillian's number. When she answered, his voice cracked with emotion. "I remember," he whispered. "I remember everything." Daniel sat across from Lillian in her small office, his hands wrapped around a cup of untouched coffee. The puppy lay at his feet, refusing to leave his side. Morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting thin stripes across the worn carpet. "It's like watching an old movie," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Parts are crystal clear and others." He trailed off, running a shaky hand through his hair. "Others are just shadows." Lillian leaned forward, her eyes gentle but focused. "Tell me what you do remember, Daniel. Every detail matters." "My mother," he started, swallowing hard. "She made pancakes every Sunday morning. I can still smell them. And Lucky, the original Lucky. He was just a puppy." His voice cracked. The puppy at his feet whimpered softly, pressing against his leg. Daniel reached down automatically to scratch its ears, finding comfort in the familiar gesture. "The fire started late at night," he continued. "I remember waking up to smoke. My mother was screaming my name. Then there were these hands, strong hands, pulling me away." He closed his eyes, concentrating. A man's voice kept saying, "Don't look back, Danny. Don't look back." Lillian's eyes widened. "Someone took you before the authorities arrived," she said. pieces clicking into place. That's why they never found you. But who would have? Daniel asked, his voice trembling. There's more, Daniel interrupted, his face pale. The voice. It was familiar, someone I knew, but everything after that is blank until I woke up in foster care. He looked up at Lillian, desperation clear in his eyes. Why would someone take me and then abandon me? Lillian stood up, pacing the small office. Your uncle, she said suddenly. The newspaper articles mentioned your mother's brother. He was devastated when they couldn't find you. She turned to face Daniel. He's still alive, Daniel. He's the only one who might know what really happened that night. Daniel's hands tightened around his coffee cup. My uncle. The word felt foreign on his tongue. I think I remember him. He used to bring me toy cars. He never stopped looking for you, Lillian said softly, even years after everyone else had given up hope. She pulled out her phone, fingers moving quickly across the screen. I can find his address. He still lives in the next town over. Daniel stood up, the puppy immediately rising with him. We need to see him, he said, newfound determination in his voice. I need to know the truth about that night. Lillian nodded, grabbing her car keys. We'll go together, she said. Whatever we find out, you don't have to face it alone. The puppy wagged its tail, looking between them expectantly, as if understanding the importance of what lay ahead. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Henry Bennett's front porch as Lillian and Daniel stood at the door. The puppy waited patiently in Lillian's car, watching through the window. Daniel's hands were trembling slightly as he reached for the doorbell. An older man with silver-streaked hair opened the door, his kind eyes crinkling with polite curiosity. Can I help you, Mr. Bennett? Lillian stepped forward. I'm Dr. Lillian Carter, and this is... She glanced at Daniel, whose face had gone pale. Are you here about the fire? Henry asked quietly, his expression softening with familiar sadness. Most people who come here are researchers or reporters wanting to talk about that night. Daniel stood frozen, staring at the man's face. Something about Henry's voice triggered a distant memory. Summer afternoons, ice cream cones, a gentle hand ruffling his hair. Mr. Bennett, Lillian said carefully, this isn't about research. This is Daniel, your nephew. The color drained from Henry's face. His hands gripped the doorframe as his knees seemed to weaken. That's not possible, he whispered, but his eyes were fixed on Daniel's face, recognition dawning in them. Uncle Henry, Daniel said softly, the words coming naturally despite years of forgetting. Henry's hands began to shake violently. I searched for you, he choked out, tears welling in his eyes. For years, I searched everywhere. I thought. He stumbled backward into the house, overwhelmed. They followed him inside to a modest living room. Henry sank into an armchair, still staring at Daniel as if he might disappear. I failed you, he said, his voice breaking. I should have kept looking. I should have never given up hope. There's something I need to show you, Henry said suddenly, standing up with renewed purpose. He led them down a hallway, stopping at a closed door. His hand rested on the doorknob for a moment before he turned it. The door creaked open to reveal a bedroom frozen in time. Model airplanes hung from the ceiling, their colors dulled by dust. A child's baseball mitt lay on a small desk next to action figures arranged in careful formation. Everything was exactly as it had been left, preserved like a museum to childhood memories. I kept it, Henry said quietly, just in case you ever came home. Daniel stepped into the room, his breathing shallow. His fingers traced the edge of the desk, leaving trails in the dust. Memories began flooding back. Homework at this desk, bedtime stories in that bed, the exact spot where his mother would kiss his forehead. Good night. I remember, Daniel whispered, picking up the baseball mitt. You taught me how to catch in the backyard, every Sunday after pancakes. Henry Bennett's hand shook as he pulled out an old wooden box from beneath his bed. Inside were carefully preserved newspaper clippings, photographs, and official reports from that terrible night. The three of them sat in the dusty bedroom, surrounded by Daniel's childhood memories, as Henry finally shared the story he'd carried alone for so many years. The fire started just after midnight, Henry began, his voice thick with emotion. Your mother called me, screaming that smoke was everywhere. I lived 20 minutes away. By the time I got there, he closed his eyes, fighting back tears. Daniel sat perfectly still, his face pale as he listened. Lillian reached over and squeezed his hand gently. The firefighters were already there, but the flames were too intense. They couldn't get inside. Henry pulled out a yellow newspaper clipping, but somehow someone did. A man in firefighter gear ran in when everyone else was pulling back. They said he wasn't following protocol, that he shouldn't have. Daniel leaned forward, his hands trembling. This man, he saved me? Henry nodded slowly. He carried you out through the back of the house. You were unconscious, barely breathing. But before anyone would talk to him or even get his name, he disappeared into the chaos. We assumed he was with the fire department. But Henry's voice trailed off as he handed Daniel another newspaper clipping. The headline read, Mystery Deepens. Unidentified firefighter missing after tragic house fire. No one ever knew who he was, Henry continued. The fire department had no record of him. It was like he appeared out of nowhere and vanished just as quickly. The official report said all their men were accounted for except this one mysterious person. Daniel stared at the clipping, his fingers tracing the grainy black and white photo of the burning house. So someone saved me, but left me grow up not knowing who I was? Why wouldn't he have said something? Lillian, who had been quietly studying the old articles, spoke up. Maybe he couldn't. Look at this. She pointed at the article. It mentions he might have been injured. There could be more to the story. There were other firefighters there that night. Henry added, good men who are still around. Some of them might remember something about this mystery man. Lillian straightened up, her mind already working. We could talk to them. After all these years, maybe they remembered something they didn't think was important before. Daniel looked between them, overwhelmed by the weight of these revelations. Someone had risked everything to save him that night, only to disappear without a trace. The question of why hung heavy in the air between them. I know some people at the fire department, Lillian said gently. We could start there, talk to the veterans who were on duty that night. Someone must remember something about this man. The small cafe buzzed with quiet morning chatter as Lillian and Daniel waited at a corner table. Daniel kept fidgeting with his coffee cup, his eyes darting to the door every time it chimed. Lillian noticed his hands trembling slightly and placed her hand over his. Try to breathe, she said softly. He'll be here. As if on cue, the door opened and an elderly man in a worn leather jacket stepped inside. Tom Reynolds moved slowly but deliberately, his weathered face carrying the weight of decades of service. His eyes scanned the cafe until they found Lillian waving him over. Dr. Carter, he said, easing himself into the chair. When you call about the Hayes fire, I almost didn't come. Some memories are better left alone. Daniel leaned forward. Please, Mr. Reynolds, I need to know about the man who saved me. Tom studied Daniel's face for a long moment, then sighed heavily. I remember that night like it was yesterday. The heat was unbearable and the smoke. He shook his head. We were ordered to pull back. The structure was too unstable. But there was this one guy who wouldn't listen. The mystery firefighter, Lillian prompted gently. Elliot Grayson. Tom said, the name coming out barely above a whisper. He wasn't even supposed to be there that night. He was off duty, but he lived nearby and heard the commotion. Showed up in his old gear. Daniel's coffee cup clattered against its saucer. You knew who he was? We all did. But after that night, Tom's eyes grew distant. He disappeared, just vanished. We thought maybe he'd been injured, died somewhere in the house. But months later, someone spotted him 2 states over, living under a different name. Lillian pulled out her notebook. What happened to him? Story goes, he suffered some serious burns getting you out. Spent months in a hospital under a fake name. By the time he recovered, he'd started a new life, new identity, new everything. Tom leaned back, his expression troubled. Last I heard, He was living up in Cedar Grove, about 3 hours north. Calls himself James Morton now. Daniel's voice was thick with emotion. But why? Why wouldn't he come forward? Some men carry guilt that's too heavy to face, Tom said quietly. Maybe saving you, but not being able to save your family. Maybe that was his burden to bear. Lillian wrote down the information, her mind already planning their next move. Cedar Grove, she repeated. We could be there by afternoon. Daniel nodded, his face set with determination. I need to meet him. I need to understand. They thanked Tom Reynolds, who grabbed Daniel's arm before they left. Whatever you find up there, remember that sometimes good men make hard choices for reasons we might never fully understand. As they walked to Lillian's car, Daniel's steps were purposeful, driven by a new sense of direction. They had a name now, a place, and perhaps finally answers waiting in Cedar Grove. The Cedar Grove care home stood peaceful and serene in the late afternoon sun. Flower beds lined the walkway, and rocking chairs swayed gently on the wide front porch. Lillian glanced at Daniel, who had gone completely still in the passenger seat of her car. Are you ready? She asked softly. Daniel's hands were clasped tightly in his lap. I've waited 25 years without knowing. Now that I'm here. He swallowed hard. What if he doesn't want to see me? Let me talk to him first, Lillian suggested, her voice gentle but firm. Sometimes big news like this needs a gentle introduction. Inside, the care home smelled of fresh coffee and pine cleaner. A kind-faced nurse directed them to a sunny sitting room where Elliot Grayson spent most of his afternoons. Lillian asked Daniel to wait in the hallway while she went ahead. The man sitting by the window looked nothing like the hero Daniel had imagined. He was thin, with silver hair and weathered hands that rested on a worn book in his lap. His eyes, though aged, still held a sharp awareness as they met Lillian's. Mr. Grayson, Lillian approached slowly. I'm Dr. Lillian Carter. I was hoping we could talk about a fire you responded to 25 years ago. Elliot Grayson's hands tightened on his book. I was a firefighter for 30 years, ma'am. There were many fires. This one was special, Lillian said quietly. You saved a little boy. The haze fire. The color drained from Elliot's face. He set the book aside with trembling hands. How did you... The boy you saved that night. He's here. He's standing right outside that door. Elliot Grayson's eyes widened, but there was fear mixed with surprise. I don't know if I can... What is it? Lillian asked, noting his distress. After that night, I hit my head badly getting out. Lost pieces of my memory. His voice cracked. I remember pulling him out, but everything else is fragments. I couldn't face anyone, not knowing if I could have done more. Before Lillian could respond, Daniel stepped into the room. He couldn't wait any longer. His eyes locked with Elliot's, and the old man's breath caught in his throat. Why did you save me? Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. Tears welled in Elliot Grayson's eyes as he looked up at Daniel. Because you reminded me of my own son, he whispered, his voice breaking. The one I lost in a fire. The silence in the sunny room felt heavy with unspoken memories. Elliot Grayson's hands trembled as he leaned forward in his chair, his eyes never leaving Daniel's face. I wasn't even supposed to be there that night, he began, his voice rough with emotion. I was driving home from visiting my sister when I saw the flames. They were so high. He closed his eyes, lost in the memory. I didn't wait for backup. 20 years of training told me every second counted. Daniel sank into the chair across from him, hanging on every word. Lillian stood quietly nearby, her heart aching for both men. The smoke was thick, but I heard crying. Upstairs. Elliot's weathered hands gripped the arms of his chair. I found you in a corner, wrapped in a blanket. You were so small, so scared, just like... His voice broke. Just like my Tommy had been. What happened after? Daniel asked softly. I got you out, but part of the roof collapsed. Hit me hard. Elliot touched the back of his head. When I woke up, I was different, confused. The doctors called it trauma-induced amnesia. I couldn't remember my name, my life, just fragments. The guilt of not knowing if I could have saved more people. He shook his head. I couldn't face anyone, so I walked away. Spent years drifting, trying to piece myself together. Daniel wiped tears from his cheeks. "You saved my life," he whispered. "All these years, I never knew who to thank." Lillian stepped forward, holding the puppy she brought with them. "Mr. Grayson, do you remember anything about a dog from that night?" Elliot's eyes fixed on the small brown puppy in Lillian's arms. Something flickered across his face. Recognition, perhaps. Then his eyes went wide. "Lucky," he muttered, the name falling from his lips like a forgotten prayer. "That was your first dog's name?" Daniel gasped, his hand flying to his mouth. The name hit him like a physical blow, unlocking another door in his memory. Images flooded back. A warm brown puppy, just like this one, licking his face as he giggled on a warm carpet. His mother's voice calling both their names for dinner. "Lucky." Daniel repeated the name, feeling both foreign and achingly familiar on his tongue. He didn't make out that night, did he?" Elliot shook his head sadly. "I heard barking, but the smoke was too thick. I had to get you out first." He looked at the puppy in Lillian's arms. "But this one, the resemblance is remarkable." Daniel's hand shook as the memories crashed over him like waves. His childhood home materialized in his mind. The worn carpet in the living room, his mother's flower-patterned curtains, and most of all, the warm brown puppy who had been his constant companion. "I remember now," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Lucky. He was my 8th birthday present. Mom said I could name him anything I wanted." A tear rolled down his cheek. "I called him Lucky because I felt like the luckiest kid in the world when I got him." Lillian watched as Daniel's eyes focused on the puppy in her arms, who wiggled and whined, desperate to reach him. She gently passed the small creature to Daniel, who cradled it close. "The night of the fire," Daniel continued, his voice distant, lost in the past. "Lucky was sleeping in my room. When the smoke came, he started barking. He woke me up. His breath hitched. But when I tried to find him in the smoke, we got separated. I called for him, but the words caught in my throat." Elliot leaned forward, placing a gentle hand on Daniel's shoulder. "The past has a way of protecting us. Sometimes, son, your mind buried those memories because you weren't ready to face them." The puppy in Daniel's arms nuzzled against his chest, its brown eyes gazing up at him with unmistakable devotion. Daniel stared at the familiar markings. The same warm chocolate coat, the same white patch on its chest, just like his Lucky had. "It can't be a coincidence," Lillian said softly. "This puppy finding you, having the same markings. Lee's bloodline must have continued all these years, waiting to find its way back to you." Daniel's fingers trembled as he stroked the puppy's soft fur. "I abandoned him at the shelter," he choked out, "just like I abandoned my memories." "No," Elliot said firmly. "You were a child who survived something terrible. The mind does what it must to protect us. What matters isn't what you forgot. It's what you do now that you remember." The puppy licked Daniel's tears away, causing a laugh to bubble up through his sobs. He held the small creature closer, feeling its heartbeat against his chest. "Steady, loving, forgiving. You really came back to me," Daniel whispered, pressing his face into the puppy's fur. "After all this time, you found your way back." The days following the revelation were a blur for Daniel. He found himself avoiding calls, missing work, and spending hours staring at old photographs that Henry had given him. The puppy, whom he couldn't bring himself to name yet, stayed close. But Daniel's guilt grew heavier with each passing hour. Lillian noticed a change in him immediately. His shoulders slumped, his eyes carried dark circles, and he barely spoke when she checked in on him. One morning, she found him sitting alone in the clinic's waiting room, his expression distant. "You're doing it again," Lillian said softly, settling into the chair beside him. "Building those walls." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I left him at a kill shelter, Lillian. What kind of person does that?" "A person who was hurting," she replied. "A person who didn't understand why a puppy's eyes brought up feelings he couldn't explain." She leaned forward, forcing him to meet her gaze. "Avoiding the past won't change it, Daniel. Trust me, I've tried." Before Daniel could respond, the clinic's door chimed. Henry Bennett stood there, his weathered face etched with concern. Daniel immediately tensed, but Henry's eyes were kind. "I had to come," Henry said, his voice rough with emotion. I couldn't, I couldn't let you disappear again. Daniel's hands gripped the armrest. I don't know how to do this, he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. Henry moved closer, each step careful, as if approaching a wounded animal. We searched for months after the fire. I hired private investigators, posted flyers, called every hospital and shelter in 3 states. His voice cracked. But after a year, after 2 years, I had to accept that maybe you were gone too. I was right here. Daniel's voice broke. All this time, I was just here. And now you're home, Henry said, tears streaming down his face. You're finally home. Something inside Daniel shattered. Years of carefully constructed walls of protection built around a heart too young to handle such loss crumbled in an instant. His shoulder began to shake, and before he could stop himself, deep, racking sobs tore from his chest. Henry didn't hesitate. He crossed the remaining distance and wrapped his arms around his nephew. Daniel collapsed into the embrace, clinging to his uncle like a child, the child he'd been forced to leave behind so long ago. I'm sorry, Daniel sobbed. I'm so sorry I forgot. No, no. Henry held him tighter. You have nothing to be sorry for. Nothing at all. Lillian watched through tears of her own as uncle and nephew clung to each other, decades of loss and longing finally finding release. The puppy, who had been quietly watching from his bed, patted over and pressed against Daniel's leg, a gentle reminder that he wasn't alone anymore. The morning sun cast long shadows across the overgrown lot where Daniel's childhood home once stood. He parked his truck at the curb, his hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel. The puppy sat quietly in the passenger seat, watching him with those knowing eyes that seemed to understand everything. I guess this is it, buddy, Daniel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He stepped out into the cool morning air, the puppy following close behind. Lillian's car was parked discreetly down the street. She had insisted on being nearby just in case. He appreciated her presence, but this was something he needed to face alone. Each step across the abandoned lot stirred memories that had been buried for so long. Where a patch of wildflowers now grew had been their front porch. He could almost hear his mother's wind chimes tinkling in the breeze. The concrete foundation was still visible in places, like the bones of his past reaching up through the earth. Dad used a grill right here, Daniel said softly, pointing to a spot near what used to be their backyard. Mom would make her famous potato salad, and we'd eat outside on summer evenings. The puppy stayed close, its warm presence anchoring him to the present as the memories washed over him. He could see it all now, the blue shutters his father had painted one spring, the flower boxes his mother tended so carefully, the tire swing that had brought him so many hours of joy. Daniel's legs felt weak as he knelt in the dirt where his living room had once been. His fingers brushed against the soil, and suddenly he could smell his mother's coffee brewing in the morning, hear his father's deep laugh echoing through the halls, feel the warmth of family movie nights curled up on their old couch. Tears fell freely now, dropping onto the earth beneath his hands. The puppy pressed against his side, offering silent comfort. It sat beside him, tail gently sweeping the ground, as if it understood the weight of this moment. From her car down the street, Lillian watched with tears in her own eyes, her heart aching for the little boy who had lost everything and the man who was finally finding his way back home. Daniel took a shaky breath, placing his palm flat against the ground. I remember now, he whispered, his voice carrying all the love and loss of 20 years. And I won't forget again. He turned to look at the puppy, this miraculous creature that had somehow found him across time and space, carrying the legacy of his first beloved pet. In those gentle eyes, he saw the thread that had led him back to himself, back to his family's love that had never truly been lost. The evening shadows lengthened across Lillian's clinic as she and Daniel sat in her office. The puppy curled contentedly between them. The usual clinical atmosphere felt warmer somehow, softened by the shared understanding that hung in the air. I bounced between 7 foster homes, Daniel said quietly, absently running his fingers through the puppy's fur. Each time I'd pack up my few belongings and move on, never questioning why I couldn't remember anything before that first home. Lillian watched him, noting how his shoulders seemed to carry the weight of those years. The puppy lifted its head, pressing closer to Daniel's hand as if sensing his pain. The strangest part was his emptiness, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper, like walking around with a missing piece, but never knowing what was lost. I just accepted it as normal. Lillian's hands tightened around her coffee mug. I understand that feeling, she said softly. After James died, my fiancé, I threw myself into work. 12, 14-hour days. Anything to keep moving, to avoid the quiet moments when the loss felt too real. Daniel looked up, surprised by her openness. The puppy's tail thumped gently against the floor, its eyes moving between them. We had a dog, Lillian continued, her voice catching slightly. A golden retriever named Charlie. He was the gentlest soul I'd ever known. After the accident that took James, Charlie, he waited by the door every day. He didn't understand why James wasn't coming home. She paused, taking a shaky breath. When Charlie passed away, 6 months later, I couldn't bear to open my heart to another pet. It felt like losing them both all over again. So you chose to help other people's animals instead, Daniel said, understanding dawning in his eyes. Lillian nodded, wiping away a tear. It was safer that way. Or so I thought. The puppy stood up, moving between them, pressing its nose first against Daniel's hand, then Lillian's. Its presence seemed to bridge the space between their shared pain. You know what's strange? Daniel said, watching the puppy. All those years of feeling lost. And here comes this little guy, leading me right back to where I needed to be, back to who I really am. Lillian smiled softly, finally allowing herself to pet the puppy's head. Maybe that's what healing looks like. Not forgetting the past, but finding the courage to move forward. The clinic was quiet now, the last rays of sunlight painting the walls in warm gold. Daniel watched as the puppy settled contentedly between them, its mission seemingly accomplished. Do you think Lucky came back for me? Daniel asked quietly. Or for both of us? Daniel stood in Lillian's clinic, adoption papers spread across the counter before him. His hand trembled slightly as he held the pen, unable to make the final signature. Lucky sat patiently at his feet, tail wagging with gentle encouragement. What's wrong? Lillian asked softly, noticing his hesitation. Daniel's voice was thick with emotion. After everything, after abandoning the first time, do I deserve this second chance? Lillian reached into her white coat pocket and pulled out a small box. I got something for you both, she said, placing it on the counter. Open it. Daniel carefully lifted the lid, revealing a shiny new collar. The metal tag caught the morning light, and he could read the freshly engraved text, Lucky on one side and finally home on the other. Because that's what you both are now, Lillian explained, her eyes warm with understanding. Home. Daniel lifted the collar with trembling fingers, the weight of its meaning heavy in his hands. Lucky sat perfectly still as Daniel knelt down beside him, carefully unfastening the old, worn collar. Thank you for finding me, Daniel whispered to the puppy, his voice cracking slightly. As he began to fasten the new collar, Lucky let out a small, excited bark. The puppy suddenly pawed at its old collar, which lay forgotten on the floor. There was an odd clicking sound as Lee's nail caught something, and a tiny panel popped open, a hidden compartment they'd never noticed before. Daniel's breath caught as a small, charred photograph fluttered to the floor. The edges were burned and yellow with age, but the image was still clear. A smiling family gathered on a sunny porch. A young boy, himself, sat cross-legged on the steps, arms wrapped around a golden retriever that could have been Lee's twin. That's my family, Daniel whispered, carefully lifting the fragile photograph. And that's the original Lucky. His fingers traced the faces of his parents, preserved in this unexpected time capsule. All this time, he was carrying this, waiting to bring it back to me. Tears spilled down his cheeks as he looked at Lucky, who pressed his wet nose against Daniel's hand. The puppy wasn't just a descendant of his childhood dog. He had been carrying the last piece of Daniel's lost home, guarding it until the right moment. Lillian knelt beside them, her own eyes glistening. Some things are meant to find their way back to us, she said softly, watching as Lucky nuzzled closer to Daniel, the new collar gleaming around his neck. Daniel held the photograph close to his heart, his other hand buried in Lee's fur. In this small, precious moment, the broken pieces of his past finally began to heal. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Henry Bennett's front yard as Daniel pulled into the driveway, Lucky sitting eagerly in the passenger seat. Lillian followed in her own car, parking behind them. She had offered to come along for moral support, though she wasn't sure Daniel would need it anymore. Henry opened the front door before they could even knock, his weathered face breaking into a warm smile. Lucky bounded up the porch steps, tail wagging furiously. "Well, look who we have here," Henry said softly, kneeling down despite his creaky knees. Lucky immediately pressed against him, accepting gentle scratches behind his ears. "The spitting image of your grandfather, aren't you, boy?" Daniel watched the interaction, his throat tight with emotion. "It's amazing, isn't it? The resemblance." Henry nodded, his eyes misty. "Your mother would spend hours playing fetch with the original Lucky in this very yard. She always said that dog had an old soul." He straightened up slowly, wincing slightly. "Speaking of this place," Henry gestured toward the house, its warm lights glowing invitingly in the growing dusk. "I want you to know something, Daniel." He paused, his voice thick with unspoken hope. "This door is always open to you. Always has been, even when I thought I'd lost you forever. If you ever want to be part of this family again." His voice trailed off, heavy with years of longing. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his hands deep in his pockets. "I wouldn't even know where to start," he admitted quietly. "It's been so long, and I've been alone for most of my life. I'm not sure I know how to be part of a family anymore." Henry disappeared inside for a moment, returning with something small in his hand. "Maybe start with this," he said, holding out a single key on a plain ring. "No pressure, no expectations, just a way home, whenever you're ready." Daniel stared at the key, its silver surface catching the last rays of sunlight. His hand trembled slightly as he took it, the metal warm from his uncle's grip. Lillian watched from a few steps back, her heart aching in an unexpected way. How long had she been like Daniel, keeping everyone at arm's length? How many chances at happiness had she let slip by, too afraid to reach out and grab them? Lucky pressed against Daniel's legs, looking up at him with those soulful eyes that seemed to understand everything. Daniel knelt down, wrapping his arms around the puppy, who had changed everything. "We're home, buddy," he whispered into Lee's fur, his voice thick with emotion. The simple words hung in the evening air, carrying the weight of years of loneliness, fear, and finally belonging. The evening shadows lengthened across the clinic floor as Lillian sat at her desk, absently shuffling through patient files. The building felt eerily quiet now that the last appointment had left. She glanced at the empty kennel where Lucky had stayed, and an unfamiliar ache settled in her chest. Over the past weeks, she'd watched Daniel and Lucky heal each other, their bond growing stronger every day. But now, in the stillness of her clinic, she realized something was missing in her own life. The wall she built around her heart, meant to protect her from pain, had also kept out joy. Without really planning to, she found herself driving to the local animal shelter. The familiar smell of antiseptic and pet food greeted her as she walked through the doors. "Everything okay?" Marcus Bennett, the shelter's manager, looked up from the front desk, surprised. "I just thought I'd look around," she said, trying to sound casual. As she walked down the row of cages, a tiny meow caught her attention. In the corner cage, a small gray kitten with white paws sat watching her. Its fur was scruffy and one ear was slightly crooked, but its green eyes held an intelligence that made Lillian pause. "This one came in last week," Marcus explained. "Found in a dumpster behind the grocery store." The kitten pressed against the cage door, purring loudly. Lillian felt something shift inside her chest, like a key turning in a long rusted lock. An hour later, she was carrying a cardboard carrier out to her car, still somewhat stunned by her own impulsiveness. The next morning, Daniel stopped by the clinic with Lucky for a routine checkup. He spotted the small cat bed behind her desk and the tiny food bowl in the corner. Well, he said, a smile tugging at his lips. "Didn't think you were a cat person." Lillian felt her cheeks warm. "Neither did I," she admitted. "But sometimes life surprises you. The kitten, whom she'd named Grace, poked her head out from under the desk and cautiously approached Lucky. To everyone's amazement, the puppy simply wagged his tail and gave the kitten a gentle sniff. That evening, as the sun began to set, the four of them sat on the bench outside the clinic. Grace was curled in Lillian's lap, while Lucky leaned against Daniel's legs. The sky blazed with orange and pink, painting everything in soft, warm light. Lillian watched as Grace stretched and purred, feeling the warmth of the tiny body against her chest. For the first time in years, she had someone to come home to. "Maybe miracles do happen," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the evening breeze. Daniel glanced at her, understanding in his eyes. Lee's tail thumped against a wooden bench, and Grace's purr grew louder, as if in agreement. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees as Daniel sat on Henry's front porch, watching Lucky chase leaves across the yard. Over the past few weeks, his uncle had shared countless stories about the family Daniel had lost, his mother's passion for gardening, his father's terrible jokes, and the countless Sunday dinners they'd shared around a worn oak table that still stood in Henry's dining room. "Your mother made the best apple pie," Henry said, settling into the chair beside him. "She'd never share the recipe with anyone, not even me." Daniel smiled, but there was a heaviness in his chest. The job offer letter sat folded in his jacket pocket, growing heavier by the minute. A construction company in Seattle wanted him as their project manager. Better pay, bigger projects, a fresh start. But as he watched Lucky bound across the yard, tail wagging with pure joy, the thought of leaving felt like a betrayal. The puppy had led him back to his past, to his family, to a sense of belonging he'd never known he was missing. Later that afternoon, Daniel found himself at Lillian's clinic. She was finishing up with a patient when she noticed his troubled expression. "Everything okay?" she asked, closing the examination room door behind her. Daniel pulled out the crumpled letter. "Got a job offer in Seattle." Lillian's face fell slightly, but she quickly masked it. "That's quite an opportunity." "Yeah," Daniel said, running a hand through his hair. "But I can't help feeling like I'd be running away again. Henry's been amazing, showing me photos, telling me stories about my parents." "And Lucky," Lillian prompted gently. He glanced at the puppy, who was curled up in his usual spot by Lillian's desk. "He brought me home. Leaving feels wrong. But staying means facing everything," Lillian said carefully. "The memories, the loss, the guilt. Some days it's overwhelming." Daniel's voice cracked slightly. "What if I was never meant to stay? What if finding my past was enough and now I'm supposed to move forward?" Lucky lifted his head, sensing Daniel's distress. The puppy patted over and placed his head on Daniel's knee, brown eyes full of unconditional love. "Maybe," Lillian said carefully, "the question isn't about what you're meant to do, but what you want to do. Your past is here, yes, but your future is wherever you choose to build it." Daniel scratched behind Lee's ears, feeling the familiar comfort of the puppy's presence. "I've spent my whole life not belonging anywhere. Now that I finally do." "It scares you," Lillian finished softly. He nodded, the truth of her words settling heavily in his chest. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to stay." Lillian watched Daniel pack his truck, each box feeling like another goodbye. She wanted to beg him to stay, to tell him how much he meant to her, how his presence had changed not just his life, but hers too. But she kept quiet, knowing this had to be his choice. Henry stood in his driveway, hands deep in his pockets, watching his nephew load the last of his belongings. "You know," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "this will always be your home, Daniel. Whether you're in Seattle or on the moon, you got family here now." Daniel paused, a cardboard box in his arms. "I know, Uncle Henry. He set the box down, unable to finish the thought. Lucky hadn't left Daniel's side all day, following him from room to room with worried eyes. Every time Daniel placed something in a box, the puppy would whimper softly, pawing at his leg. "He knows something's wrong," Lillian said, watching Lee's unusual behavior. The normally playful puppy seemed subdued, almost anxious. That evening, as Daniel finished packing the last few items in his apartment, Lucky suddenly grew agitated. He barked once sharply, then darted through the door Daniel had left cracked open. Lucky, Daniel called out, but the puppy was already gone, disappearing into the gathering darkness. Word spread quickly through the small town. Neighbors joined the search, flashlights cutting through the night. Henry organized search parties, while Lillian called everyone she knew from the clinic. "He's never run off before," Daniel said, his voice tight with worry. As they drove down another dark street, Daniel's grip on the door handle tightened. "This isn't like him," Lillian said, her voice filled with concern. She gripped the steering wheel tighter. "We'll find him, Daniel. He has to be somewhere." After hours of searching, a thought struck Lillian. "The old house," she said suddenly. "Have we checked there?" They drove to the outskirts of town, where the ruins of Daniel's childhood home still stood. As they pulled up, their headlights caught a familiar shape, sitting perfectly still among the overgrown weeds. Lucky sat there, tail wagging slightly, exactly where Daniel's front door had once been. He looked at them calmly, as if he'd been waiting all along. Daniel stepped out of the car slowly, his feet crunching on the gravel. "Lucky," he called softly. The puppy didn't move, just watched him with those knowing eyes. In that moment, surrounded by the remnants of his past and the reality of his present, Daniel felt something shift inside him. Lillian stood back, watching as Lucky finally stood and walked to Daniel, pressing against his legs in that familiar way. The puppy looked up at his owner, and in those eyes was a simple truth. Some things were meant to stay exactly where they belonged. Daniel sat in the damp grass, letting his fingers trail through the overgrown weeds where his childhood home once stood. Lucky pressed against his side, warm and steady, like an anchor holding him in place. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of wild honeysuckle that had taken over the abandoned lot. "You knew exactly what you were doing, didn't you?" Daniel whispered to Lucky, who looked up at him with those intelligent eyes. The puppy's tail wagged slowly, deliberately, as if confirming what Daniel was beginning to understand. Lillian stood a few feet away, her hands tucked into her jacket pockets, watching connection between man and dog grow stronger with each passing moment. She could see the tension leaving Daniel's shoulders, like a weight being lifted. "All this time," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion, "I thought I needed to leave to find myself, but I was already found, wasn't I?" He scratched behind Lee's ears, earning a contented sigh from the puppy. Henry approached slowly, his footsteps careful on the uneven ground. The older man's face was lined with hope and worry, a father's concern etched in every feature. Daniel looked up at the night sky, stars twinkling above the empty lot where his life had both ended and begun. Lucky nuzzled his hand, and in that simple gesture, everything became clear. "We're not leaving, are we?" Daniel asked, looking at Lucky, though it wasn't really a question anymore. The puppy barked once, soft and sure, as if saying, "Finally." With trembling fingers, Daniel pulled out his phone. The number for the Seattle company was already dialed, waiting for his final decision. He pressed the call button, and in the quiet night air, everyone could hear the ring. "Hello, Mr. Hayes," a crisp voice answered. "Are you ready to discuss your start date?" Daniel's voice was steady, certain. "Actually, I'm calling to decline the position. I've realized my home is here. Thank you for the opportunity." The call ended, and Daniel felt lighter than he had in years. He looked up to see Henry beaming, tears glistening in his uncle's eyes. "You're staying?" Henry asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm staying," Daniel confirmed, rising to his feet. "This is where I belong." Lillian watched the scene unfold, feeling something warm bloom in her chest. It was hope, pure and unexpected, filling spaces she thought would stay empty forever. Lucky bounded between them all, his tail wagging furiously now, celebrating in his own way. Daniel walked to his truck, grabbed his packed suitcase, and tossed it aside with a laugh. He knelt down, wrapping his arms around Lucky in a tight embrace. "Thank you," he whispered into the puppy's fur. "Thank you for bringing me home." The seasons changed, painting the small town in autumn colors as Daniel Hayes settled into his new life. Henry Bennett's house, once quiet and filled with memories of loss, now echoed with the sound of hammering and sawing. Daniel spent his weekends helping his uncle renovate, turning the dusty spare bedroom into his own space. Lucky followed Daniel everywhere, his paws pattering across newly laid hardwood floors. The puppy had grown bigger, but his devotion remained unchanged. Sometimes he would sit and watch Daniel work, head tilted as if supervising every repair. Lillian stopped by often, bringing coffee and sometimes staying to help. There was something different in the way she and Daniel looked at each other now. Gentle glances that lingered, shared smiles that held unspoken words. Their friendship had grown into something deeper, though neither seemed ready to name it. One crisp morning, as Daniel stood at the edge of his old property, an idea took root. The overgrown lot had haunted him for so long, but now he saw a possibility where there was once only pain. "What if," he said to Lillian, who stood beside him, "we turned this into something beautiful? A garden, maybe for Mom and Dad and my sister." Lillian's eyes softened. "A memorial garden?" "Yeah." Daniel nodded, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "With benches and flowers, a place where people could come to remember their own loved ones, too." The idea spread to the town like wildfire. Soon, volunteers began showing up with tools and plants. Henry brought his old landscaping equipment, and local businesses donated supplies. Even Tom Reynolds, the retired firefighter, came with his grandson to help clear the land. They worked together under the autumn sun, transforming the abandoned lot day by day. Where charred ruins once stood, rose bushes now took root. Along winding paths, they planted maple saplings that would one day grow tall and strong. Lucky supervised it all, darting between workers with excited barks, as if he understood the significance of what they were creating. Sometimes he would dig alongside the volunteers, his enthusiasm making everyone laugh. Daniel watched it all with a full heart. This wasn't erasing the past. It was honoring it in a new way. Each flower planted was a memory preserved. Each path laid was a story remembered. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in soft oranges, Daniel stood in the half-finished garden. Lucky sat quietly beside him, both of them watching the last rays of light catch on the newly installed memorial plaque that bore his family's names. Lillian approached softly, her presence as natural as breathing now. Without words, she slipped her hand into his, squeezing gently. Henry joined them, placing a weather hand on Daniel's shoulder. In that moment, surrounded by the fresh earth and new growth, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Pure, uncomplicated peace. The autumn days grew shorter, but Daniel's hours at the clinic seemed to fly by. He had started volunteering there 3 days a week, helping Lillian with everything from filing paperwork to assisting with rescued animals. Lucky came along, too, somehow knowing exactly which scared animals needed a friendly nudge or a gentle presence. Daniel discovered he had a natural way with the animals, especially the most traumatized ones. Maybe it was because he understood what it felt like to be lost and afraid. The way he could calm a frightened dog or coax a nervous cat from its hiding place amazed even Lillian, who had years of experience. "You've got a gift," she told him one afternoon as they watched a formerly aggressive rescue dog eat calmly from Daniel's hand. "They trust you." Daniel shrugged, but his eyes were warm. "I guess we recognize each other, the ones who need a second chance." The clinic became more than just a workplace. It became a sanctuary where both Daniel and Lillian could be themselves, where the walls they built around their hearts slowly began to crumble. Their routine developed its own comfortable rhythm. Morning checkups, afternoon treatments, and evening paperwork that somehow always led to long conversations. Henry often dropped by with dinner for them both, claiming he just happened to make too much. But the knowing smile on his face as he watched them work together said otherwise. He saw how his nephew had changed. The tension gone from his shoulders, the shadows lifted from his eyes. This wasn't just Daniel finding his place. It was Daniel becoming who he was always meant to be. One evening, as the sunset painted the clinic walls in soft orange light, Lillian and Daniel worked together to close up. Lucky dozed in his favorite spot under the reception desk, his paws twitching in dreams. The day had been long, but satisfying. They'd successfully treated 3 emergency cases and found homes for 2 abandoned kittens. Lillian paused in her task of organizing files, watching Daniel as he gently covered the recovery kennels with blankets. He moved with such care, whispering good night to each animal. The sight made something warm bloom in her chest. "I'm glad you stayed," she said softly, the words coming out before she could think about them. Daniel turned to face her, and in the fading light, his smile was gentle and sure. "Me too," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. "And I think I was always meant to." From the doorway, Henry watched silently, his heart full at the sight of his nephew's happiness. This was what he'd hoped for all those years, not just finding Daniel, but seeing him truly come home. Lucky chose that moment to wake up, padding over to sit between Daniel and Lillian. His tail wagged as he looked between them, and his happy bark echoed through the quiet clinic. Daniel and Lillian's eyes met over the puppy's head, and in that lingering glance was everything they hadn't yet said but someday would. The autumn leaves danced in the gentle breeze as Daniel walked to the open field, watching Lucky chase butterflies. The puppy's boundless energy and joy were contagious, making Daniel laugh more freely than he had in years. The weight of his forgotten past no longer pressed down on his shoulders. Instead, each memory felt like a treasure recovered, making him stronger. Across town, Lillian sat in her living room, smiling as her newly adopted kitten, Shadow, batted playfully at a string. She marveled at how much her life had changed. The wall she'd built around her heart had crumbled, replaced by a warmth she'd almost forgotten existed. From his porch, Henry watched his nephew working in the memorial garden. Flowers now bloomed where ashes once lay, and seeing Daniel at peace filled Henry's heart with a quiet joy. The years of searching, of hoping against hope, had finally led to this. His family whole again, even if in an unexpected way. As the afternoon light turned golden, Daniel walked down the familiar road toward Lillian's clinic, Lucky trotting happily beside him. Suddenly, the puppy stopped in his tracks. He turned, tail wagging excitedly, exactly as he had done that first night at the clinic, when everything began. Lillian, standing in the clinic doorway, couldn't help but laugh at the sight. "It's like he always knew where you belonged," she said, her voice soft with affection. Daniel knelt down, scratching Lee's ears as the puppy leaned into his touch. "Maybe he did," he replied, smiling. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks as the three of them, a man who had found his way back home, a woman who had opened her heart again, and the remarkable dog that had brought them together, walked side by side down the quiet street. If you enjoyed the story of Dr. Lillian and Lucky, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.